Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply. In this video is to bring you a closer look at the Stanley number FBB168 6x4.5 in a US 10B finish. Here's that hinge. Epically large hinge. Unusual to look at in terms of its size in comparison to what you might expect. It's heavy too, weighs about 2 1/4 pounds, which is a pound heavier than a standard hinge basically. This is an order for a client who has an abnormally thick 1 3/4 door. They have a door that's 1 3/4 thick, but it's unusually heavy. And it's really on the boundaries of where you would no longer be installing a butt hinge. The door's 200 plus pounds. And the question was, what hinge can be used? We discussed, of course, trying to not use butt hinges for such an installation. And looking back at the original conversation, the client asked if it was possible to use the FBB168 5x5 on an 1 3/4 thick door. And a 5-inch wide hinge is just too wide for an 1 3/4 thick door. You can't get the leaf properly installed onto the door and have the screw holes safely located within the thickness of the door. So going with in the concept of heavyweight and 5x5 was because of the weight of the door, which after I told the client a 5x5 wouldn't work, the client asked if a 4.5 would work for an 1 3/4 thick door that was 280 pounds. And that, of course, I've seen that sort of installation. I've seen a lead line door hung on butts, but it's just a failure waiting to happen. It is literally a failure that is going to occur because that hinge is not rated for that weight whatsoever. And in fact, you are really more likely limited to about maybe a 200-pound door, where the duty that might, I'm looking at a sizing chart, maybe a 150-pound door for 3 hinges in a moderate sort of sense would really be the limitation for a 4.5 standard weight hinge. So my response was, how tall is the door, and what makes it that heavy? And because you really leave, and after having a long discussion about, don't use butt hinges, use pivots. Pivots are proper for this door weight, easily can be ordered to handle a weight like that as well. However, they had already prepped the door for hinges to find out that it had failed, which I then later learned in the conversation. So now this turns out to be fix the mistake. Okay, so now we're trapped to a butt hinge because you've got a door and a frame that are already prepped for butts. Told the client that a hinge for that weight is not the best idea, where pivots would be superior. However, if I was going to use a butt hinge, I would go with the tallest hinge I could, the thickest grade I could, and that would permit me to still have a 4.5-inch width, because that's what the original door was prepped for. So I suggested the FBB168 in a 6-inch tall that was still 4.5 wide. And this hinge is indeed 4.5-inch wide. It just looks unusual because of that really uncommon height. And then a heavyweight hinge as well is what I had suggested. So in a hinge, 6 is the first dimension, and that's the height. Not like doors. The first dimension on a door is the width. On a hinge, it's the height. That's 4.5. Now this is a steel-based hinge. Okay. FBB 168, all that conspires to mean several things, in fact. That it's a 5-knuckle hinge, that it has 4 bearing packets because it is 190 thousandths thick. I'm going to look that up. It might be a little bit heavier. It might be 210 thousandths thick. Let's take a look so that you know. And I'm going through the catalog to find where that part number comes up. Okay, and a 6-inch, a 6 by 4.5 is 203 thousandths thick. So using the logic of the a gauge for the weight of the hinge, pardon me, a weight of the door that the hinge can handle. Looking at Stanley's catalog, which I refer to often because it's an encyclopedic volume of hinge facts and figures. When you look at a 6 or a 5 by 5 anyway, in terms of weight rating, well, extending the logic of the catalog, they're 6-inch tall hinges, and they do not have one listed for 6 by 4.5, but they have a 6 by 5 that is listed in a 4.5, 4.5, up to a 6 by 5. Where you can have about a 225-pound door on a 4.5, 4.5 if it's a heavyweight. Well, at least they're concealed bearing version. Up to literally a door that exceeds 300 pounds when you get to 6 by 5. So in my mind, logically, I'm expecting a moderate usage, and I'm expecting a weight characteristic much more similar to 6-inch tall, 5-inch wide, rather than a 5 by 5, because there is documentation that states for every ½ inch in height that you increase the hinge, you significantly increase its ability to hold or to bear load. And that's why you're very often going to see on commercial projects a 5-inch tall hinge and 4.5 wide when you're dealing with doors that are greater than 3'6". Very common because it's a heavier door. So using some educated conclusion deduction, I've taken their hinge chart and kind of become comfortable with the concept that a 6 tall heavyweight is going to handle that 280 pound thick, 280 pound heavy door. And the rest of the conversation with the client talks about the installation or what the construction and composition of the door itself is. And what they're actually doing here is they're taking a couple of small panels, smaller panels, and they don't give me the width, but they're going to hinge them together so that one door will fold back, but the hinges to hold the entire assembly to the jamb is where this comes in. So they're probably using a couple of 2'8" by 7' doors that they've hinged together, sauce hinges in the center, and they're going to fold that one back and be able to stack the entire door assembly against a perpendicular wall. So an unusual application. And that's the conclusion that we came to with where we're going to use these specific hinges. Now, talking about the Stanley FBB168, let's get into that. So let's dissect the part number. FBB168, again, all that conspires to mean full mortise. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaf there that the hinges are meant to be parallel, mortised flush to the door and frame when they're brought parallel, to allow that typical margin between the door and frame. It's a 5-knuckle hinge, and when it's heavyweight, the .203, it has 4 bearing packets. Okay, this would be considered a template pattern when it comes to a 6-inch tall hinge. This would be a universal or template pattern in this sort of scenario. Does mean that it's steel-based. You can obviously order these in a non-ferrous-based material, in either stainless or an architectural brass type hinge. There is a link below this video to a document called Template that will allow you to review all of the dimensional properties of this hinge, 6 by 4.5, 6 by 5, 6 by 6, and gives you the location of the screw holes for that material, all the dimensional properties. Below this video are additional is bullet points of the extended description, which we have covered. Screws are included in a complementary finish. And because this is steel-based, of course, the oil-rubbed bronze is going to be... it's not true oil-rubbed bronze because it's steel. Oil-rubbed bronze would be made on bronze. But this is a good oil-rubbed finish, I do have to state. And I like Stanley hinges a lot, even though we don't do a lot of business with Stanley on their hinges. That's unfortunate, and I always look to increase that because the fit and finish is very good. The crotch of the hinge leaf and the barrel down in here is the weak point where I've seen other hinge manufacturers, major ones, right down in here, do a poor job at best when it comes to finishing the hinge. A poor job. And Stanley excels. Another thing I like about Stanley is their hinges are just smooth. Other hinge manufacturers' hinges do not swing that elegantly. Okay, I'm a fan of their nice ball tip, their button tips. I like the hinge in every regard, and Stanley is my personal favorite when it comes to caliber, quality, fit, and finish. And I recommend that if you've got a project that you care about the hinge and you want that hinge to be there decades later, go right to Stanley. Fit and finish, performance, I don't know how many, a century and a half of pure experience. Other manufacturers have that as well. But Stanley, because they take attention to detail on their hinge and the finishing in particular, because I've had other manufacturers' hinges refused, especially tricky oil-rubbed bronze, because the finish is unacceptable. It's either not even a remote attempt at what oil-rubbed bronze looks like, or the finishing is incomplete. And Stanley, I've never had a Stanley hinge rejected for either of those purposes, and I have twice this year alone for other manufacturers, 2 different manufacturers in fact. Permanently lubricated non-detachable ball bearings. The hinge, of course, is reversible. You can certainly drive that pin out should you need to and flip all that over. They do have a stamp on the back of the part number, but I'm actually grateful that the logo isn't stamped into the hinge leaf because I think it detracts from the overall elegance of the hinge. And quite frankly, if you're in the business of selling hardware, a Stanley hinge looks like a Stanley hinge. Nobody else's hinge looks that way. So they're easy to detect from an industry professional's perspective. So finally, we went with this hinge because my expectations that it will handle the weight, 6 tall, 4.5 wide. There is a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the Stanley products that we sell, but a link to the manufacturer's website where you're going to find Stanley's involvement with many other areas of hardware, locks, door closers, exit devices. Best Lock as well is under the Stanley umbrella, as is Precision and other items. But then there's that full-line catalog where you can pull up all that encyclopedic knowledge when it comes to hinges. And if you spend any time, if you make a living in the construction industry, hinges seem to be the literal link between a healthy operating door and one that doesn't. So if you involve yourself in doors, I would suggest that you review the first dozen or so pages of the Stanley catalog and simply become familiar with the industry terms of full mortise, half surface, half mortise, full surface. Understand what those terms mean. Look at the sizing chart. Look at the hinges that are available in terms of design. 2-knuckle, 3-knuckle, 5-knuckle. The different thicknesses, the different sizes that are available. That the base materials that are available as well. Just so that you're able better to answer questions or to proceed properly when it comes to hinge selection. But it also just helps demystify the hinge. You think it's just a hinge. Well, it turns out there's a million different versions of it, and there's likely a hinge that will handle the solution that you're looking at, the problem that you're looking to solve. I'm a fan of Stanley. I hope that's obvious because I think they deserve it. Any questions on the FBB168, 6x4.5, US 10B hinge, and obviously all the finishes are available, or any other Stanley product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.